The denial had already begun by the time Mara was brought into the room. She had not been escorted. She had been collected, which was a different thing entirely. Two men she did not know had appeared at the door of the small flat where she had been living for the past 3 months, and they had used the word invitation. And she had understood from the way they stood in her doorway that the word was decorative. The hall they brought her to was long and cold and lit by something other than electricity. She noticed that immediately. The light came from fixtures that should have held bulbs, but the glow was too even, too old, and it did not hum. At the far end of the room, a man stood behind a table of dark wood. He was wearing a suit the colour of charcoal, and he was already speaking when she entered. The claim is baseless. His voice carried the way stone walls carry. She felt it before she processed it. She had heard that voice before, in a different room, under different circumstances, and she had spent 11 weeks trying to forget the particular way it settled. The woman seated across the table from him had a folder open in front of her. She did not look up. Then you will not object to the examination. I object to the premise. Mara stopped walking. The man who had collected her took 1 step forward, hand at her elbow, and she understood that she was being positioned. She was a prop in a hearing she had not been told was happening. He had not looked at her yet. He was, she realized, deliberately not looking at her, and that told her more than anything spoken in the room had told her. A man with nothing to answer for does not need to arrange where he places his eyes. She was employed in this house for 6 weeks. He addressed the room rather than the woman across the table. Kitchen service. Any number of people move through a household of this size. The woman across the table wrote something down. The dating of the pregnancy is not in dispute. The woman with the folder kept her eyes on the page. The timing is. Then examine the timing. You will find nothing that points to me. He said it cleanly. The way a man says a thing he has rehearsed, which is to say, the way a man says a thing he is afraid of. Mara Voss, 26 years old, previously employed as a clinical midwife at St. Agatha's Public Hospital before her contract was terminated without cause, stood in a hall that cost more than her childhood home and understood that she was expected to be ashamed. She was not. She was very, very tired, but she had delivered 43 babies in underfunded wards with equipment that broke mid-procedure, and she had learned in that work that the moment requiring the most precision was always the moment that felt most impossible. She lifted her chin and waited for someone to invite her to speak. They did not invite her to speak. They sent her to an antechamber with a wooden bench and a painting of a landscape she did not recognize, and the guard who positioned himself outside the door did so with a particular finality that suggested the door was not, in any practical sense, available to her. She sat. She was 12 weeks along. She knew this with clinical precision because she had performed her own assessment twice, in the bathroom of the flat on Creswick Lane, with equipment she had not returned when St. Agatha's let her go. She knew the date of conception the way she knew her own blood type. She knew it, and she knew who. And she knew that the man currently refusing to know it had been, for a period of approximately 4 hours in October, someone she had allowed herself to believe was genuinely kind. She had been wrong about things before. She turned the phone over in her hands. Her sister was in Glasgow and had not answered a call in 3 weeks. Her mother had been gone since Mara was 3 days old. Her last employer was the reason she no longer had a professional reference. The hospital where she had trained was publicly funded and perpetually understaffed, and the consultant who might have vouched for her had retired in August. The guard shifted his weight. Through the door she could hear voices she could not fully make out, and then she heard the woman with the folder say, "Clearly, we require the subject's presence at the examination." And the man whose voice she had been trying not to think about answered, also clearly, "She may be present. She is not to be addressed as a subject." It was such a specific correction to make when he had just spent the previous 15 minutes asserting She was no one particular to him. She looked at the phone. She had not used the number in 11 weeks. She had saved it under a name she had invented on the spot because she did not know what else to call it, and she had told herself repeatedly that saving it was only a precaution, the way one saves the number for a hospital one hopes never to need. She had a 6% battery. Outside the door, the guard shifted again, and she heard a second set of footsteps, heavier, moving in a direction she could not track, and she thought about the word examination and what it meant that the woman with the folder was the one pushing for it. Someone believed her. She did not know who the woman with the folder was, but someone in that room had looked at the dates and thought, that is possible. She opened the phone. She typed, "I am in a building I do not know the address of, and I have been brought here without being asked, and I need someone to know where I am." She sent it before she could decide it was a poor choice. The reply came in 14 seconds. It said, "Name of the street you arrived on," she thought. She had been watching through the car window, which they had not covered, because apparently the kind of people who collected you in this way did not consider you worth the effort of blindfolding. She typed the name of the junction she had seen last before the car turned. His reply came in 9 seconds. It said, "Stay where you are." That was all. She held the phone and thought about the first time she had used that number, which had been 11 weeks ago and 1 floor above this one, in circumstances she had not expected and which had not been her intention. She had been working the kitchen service, which she had taken because her savings ran out in September and because the agency placed her, and she needed the placement more than she needed the dignity of explaining to a stranger that she had training above her current pay grade. The house ran events. She moved trays. She was not supposed to be on the residential floors. She had gone to the wrong floor. She had stepped out of the service lift and into a corridor that was clearly not the catering level, and she had turned to go back, and she had heard a sound that stopped her, which was a man's voice, low and careful, coming through an open door, and the quality of it was the sound of someone trying to contain something enormous. She had looked in because she was a clinical person, and containment like that, in her experience, was often the sound of someone managing pain. He had been sitting in a chair in a dark room with his hand pressed flat against the wall, and he had looked at her without alarm, which she thought was strange for a man who had been caught in a private moment by a stranger. He had said, "You have a cut on your wrist." She had looked down. She did, a serving tray edge, earlier that evening. He had stood and taken a small kit from a cabinet and addressed the cut himself, without asking permission, without explaining why, and when he handed the number to her afterward, he added only, "in case." She had not asked in case of what. Now she knew. The phone screen went black, 6%. Then nothing. The message landed at 8 minutes past 10 in the evening, which was when Cale Draveth, 431 years old, sovereign of the Northern Compact, and currently the subject of a formal challenge by the Obsidian Accord, was standing in the upper study of his own house reading a charter document that was going to require him to make a decision he did not want to make. His advisor Aldrich was in the chair by the window, waiting with the specific patience of a man who has been waiting for 4 centuries and has made his peace with it. The message appeared on the secondary phone, not the formal line. The other one. Kyle read it once. He read it again. He put the charter document face down on the desk. "There is a woman in the east antechamber." He said it to the room without turning. Aldrich looked up. "There is a woman in the east antechamber who arrived with the Accord's examination team. She did not arrive with them. She arrived separately and was collected by someone on Vaughan's instruction. She used the junction of Creswick and the Amber Road as a reference point." Aldrich was quiet for a moment. "That places her on the Accord side of the building." "Yes." "And you know her." Kyle had already moved to the door. He was aware of what happened in his face when he moved with intention rather than with deliberate stillness, and he was aware that Aldrich was watching it happen, and he found, for the first time in a long time, that he did not particularly care what his expression communicated. The examination is going to proceed. His voice remained level as he reached the door. I want Aldrich's complete witness record. I want the full court present. And I want the physician on staff in that room before Vaughan's examiner begins. Aldrich had risen from the chair. He was a careful man, and careful men did not usually ask the questions they were thinking in front of their sovereigns. But he asked this one. You want witnesses to an examination you are publicly opposing? Cale paused with his hand on the frame. I want witnesses because the examination is going to produce a specific finding. He did not turn around. And when it does, I want every member of the Accord's delegation to have seen it with their own eyes and have no grounds to dispute what happens afterward. He left. In the chair by the window, Aldrich sat for 1 moment longer, and then he reached for the formal notification ledger, because he had served this man for a very long time, and he understood what that sentence meant. It meant the king already knew exactly what the examination would find. 8:51. The woman with the folder, whom Mara would later learn was called Examiner Rice, opened the antechamber door herself. She had the particular bearing of a professional who has been put in a room with powerful men for long enough that she has stopped finding them impressive. We are ready for you. Mara stood. 8:53. Cale left the residential wing by the rear stair, which was not the fastest route, but which kept him out of the Accord's sight for an additional 4 minutes. He needed 4 minutes. He moved down the service corridor at a pace that was not quite running, because running communicated something he could not afford to communicate. Aldrich's message reached him on the landing, examination beginning, Vaughan's team present, 4 court witnesses assembled. He typed back, add 8 more. Aldrich replied with a single character. 8:56. The examination room was a clinical white that looked recently prepared. Mara noticed the table, the equipment set, the overhead lamp adjusted for close work, and recognized everything. She had worked a room like this for 3 years. She knew what each instrument was for, and in what sequence they would be used. Examiner Rice gestured toward the table. This is a standard gestational assessment. You may ask questions at any point. I know the procedure. Rice looked at her properly for the first time. What was your field? Obstetrics, St. Agatha's. 6 years. Rice was still for a moment. Then you already know what this is going to show. Yes, and the date. Yes, and what the date means. Mara looked at the equipment laid out on the tray beside her. A bone-handled probe she recognized from the older inventory sets, the kind public hospitals could not afford to replace, the kind she had used several 100 times. I know exactly what it means. 9:02. Cale was crossing the lower hall at the wrong angle and corrected without slowing. 2 of his own guards fell in behind him without being asked, because they knew his pace, and they knew what it meant when he moved this way. He had not moved this way in 11 years. A 3rd guard tried to intercept him to report on the Accord's representative status, and Kyle spoke 4 words without stopping. The guard moved aside. 9:06. The first finding was complete. Examiner Rice noted it. She noted a second. She made no sound, but the pen stilled in her hand for 1 moment. From the doorway, one of the Accord's representatives shifted forward. Rice did not look up. Please remain where you are, she continued. 9:09. Cale reached the East Wing corridor. He could hear voices through the door. He recognized the register of a room that has just received information and has not yet processed it. He put his hand on the door. 9:10. Examiner Rice set the pen down. She looked at Mara first, which Mara thought was a precise and deliberate professional courtesy. The gestational age is consistent with the conception date of the 9th of October. The finding is unambiguous. The room went entirely silent. From the Accord side, someone began to say something. The door opened. He did not come in slowly. He crossed the room in 4 steps and put himself between Mara and the Accord's representative before the man had finished the first word of whatever he had been about to say, and the representative stopped. No one spoke. Kyle turned to Examiner Rice. Read it aloud. Reese was a professional. She read it aloud. Gestational age, conception date, clinical indicators consistent with a single conception event. The language was precise and without interpretation, which was what made it devastating, because it required every person in the room to supply the interpretation themselves. The representative from the Accord opened his mouth. You were told. Cale's attention did not move from the man. She is not to be addressed as a subject. That direction stands in this room regardless of who issued the invitation for this examination. The representative closed his mouth. Cale turned then, and he fixed his gaze on the man seated at the table who had spent the last 40 minutes speaking on the Accord's behalf. When he spoke, his voice did not raise, and did not need to. You have a choice. You may update your formal record to reflect the findings, or I will ensure that the falsification of your prior testimony is the first item on every Accord communication for the next calendar year. Aldrich will witness which you choose. The man at the table picked up his pen. Cale turned to face the room. She is not a subject. She is not a contested claim. She is not a piece of evidence in someone else's argument. He paused. These findings are entered into the formal record of this House under my full authority, and any challenge to them will be answered as a challenge to me directly. There were 12 people in the room. 8 of them were witnesses Aldrich had assembled. Every one of them was watching. Then Kyle crossed to where Mara was standing, and he did something that she would think about for a long time afterward, in the same way you think about a thing that rearranges your understanding of what is possible. He knelt. Not partially, not as a gesture. He knelt, on the floor of his own examination room, in the charcoal suit that cost more than several months of her last salary, and he looked up at her. I am sorry for what you were asked to stand in and hear. She did not cry. She had learned not to cry in rooms where it could be used as evidence of something. The record is corrected. Yes, then we can go. He rose. He offered his arm, not to display possession, but because she was 12 weeks pregnant and had been sitting on a wooden bench for 40 minutes and had just endured a clinical examination in a room full of people who viewed her as a procedural problem. She took it. Behind them, Aldrich closed the ledger with a sound like a full stop at the end of a sentence that had taken 11 weeks to finish. The room he brought her to was on the residential level, which she recognised from the service lift and the particular quality of the light. He did not take her to a guest room. He took her to a sitting room that adjoined his own, and he sat her in the chair nearest the fire, and he brought the physician himself rather than sending for one. The physician's name was Dr. Per Halson. He was old enough that Mara could not have placed his age within 2 decades in either direction, and he worked with the economy of someone who had done clinical assessments for a very long time without once being in a hurry. She answered his questions. Halson noted her professional background without commenting on it, which she appreciated. When he was finished, she looked across at Cale. I am sorry about the examination. The venue and the circumstances. I know it was not what you planned for this evening. Cale was standing by the window because he seemed to prefer standing. He studied her. What makes you think I had planned an evening? You had the charter document out. You noticed the charter document. It was on the desk when Aldrich's man brought me through the corridor. The Accord's crest on the corner. I know that crest because we had a case at St. Agatha's 2 years ago that involved a dispute of similar administrative weight, and the same compact logo appeared on several of the formal notices. Halson packed his case. He gave Cale a brief nod on the way out, the kind of nod that carried a sentence's worth of information compressed into 3 degrees of chin angle, and Cale received it without visible reaction. You are not to apologise for what happened in that room. I am apologising for the administrative inconvenience. There was no inconvenience. You were in the middle of something important. He crossed the room and sat in the chair across from her, not near enough to crowd and not far enough to signal distance. The charter document was important. What happened in the examination room was more important. I want to be exact about that, so that you do not spend the next several hours constructing a version in which you were an inconvenience, because I can see from the way you are sitting that this is already in progress. She looked at him. He was not wrong. You will stay here tonight. Tomorrow we will talk about what comes next. Tonight Halson will return in 2 hours with something for the headache, because you have the particular expression of someone who has had one for several hours and has been managing it. She had. She had had it since the 2 men appeared in her doorway. How did you know about the headache? You touched the left side of your head twice during the examination. Once when Rice read the date aloud, and once when the representative tried to speak. She said nothing. Rest. He left her the chair and the fire. She woke to a room with a ceiling that was not the ceiling of the flat on Creswick Lane. The flat on Creswick Lane had a water stain in the northwest corner that had been there when she arrived, and that she had reported twice to the agency, and that had taught her a great deal about which problems the agency considered addressable. The flat had a radiator that worked on a schedule it had invented itself, and a window that faced an extractor fan from the restaurant below, and a mattress that had served at least 3 previous tenants more faithfully than it was currently serving her. This ceiling was plasterwork, detailed, pale, and silent. She lay still for a moment and did a clinical inventory of her own, which was a habit she had developed in her 2nd year of training and had never lost. 12 weeks, no new pain. Adequate rest indicated by the quality of waking. Good. On the table beside the bed there was a glass of water and a small dish containing 3 plain crackers, which was such a specific and practical gesture toward first trimester nausea that she sat up and looked at it for a long time. He had left it, or had someone leave it, without being asked, because she had not mentioned the nausea to Halson, and she had not mentioned it to him. He had simply known, or assumed, or considered it likely, and had addressed it without fanfare. She ate the crackers. She drank the water. There was a knock at the connecting door at 8:30, and he entered carrying a 2nd glass of water and a piece of toast with the particular care of someone who is not accustomed to carrying toast, and has decided to treat this as a task requiring full attention. You did not need to do that. I am aware. He set it on the table and sat in the chair by the window, and they talked for approximately 40 minutes, which was the only quiet the next several days would produce, and which she would return to in memory often, not because anything significant was said, but because nothing was required of her in it. He asked what she had studied before obstetrics. She told him about the public hospital program, about the professor who had told her she had the most precise spatial memory he had seen in a student, and also the worst professional boundaries, which she had taken as a compliment on both counts. He laughed at that. Not much, but genuinely. She thought, he is more dangerous than he looks. And he looks extremely dangerous, and I am going to need to remember that. Then the doors at the end of the hall opened without permission, and the quiet was over. They were not knocking. Whoever had opened the doors had done so with the particular confidence of someone who considers announcement a courtesy they are not required to extend. Kael rose from the chair. The woman who entered the sitting room was wearing a coat the colour of old pewter, and she carried a document case under one arm, and she walked as though the floor she was walking on was technically hers under several existing agreements. She was followed by 2 men who stopped at the threshold and remained there. She was not young and she was not old. She had the aspect of someone who has been negotiating from a position of structural advantage for long enough that she no longer thinks about it. She looked at Mara once, a precise, assessing look, and then directed herself entirely to Kyle. Cassia Vaughan, First Envoy, Obsidian Accord. I know who you are. Kale's voice had changed, not louder, more specific. Then you know why I am here. She opened the document case and placed a single folded paper on the small table between the chairs, the founding charter of the Accord. Article 11, subsection 3. Any child born of a verified sovereign bloodline and an unclaimed mortal bearer is a ward of the full compact from the moment of confirmed gestational status. The examination last night produced a confirmation. Kale did not move toward the paper. The examination last night produced a formal record entered under my authority in my house, entered under your authority as the child's father, which is precisely the circumstance that triggers Article 11. You have a declared interest. The Charter requires a neutral custodial arrangement until the birth. She paused. We are not asking for permanent custody. We are asking for the woman and the child to be housed in a neutral facility for the remainder of the pregnancy. It is standard protocol. Mara had been very still since the woman walked in. She was still now. She looked at the folded paper on the table, and she looked at the document case under Vaughan's arm, and she thought, this is what the charter document was about last night. This is what he was reading when the message came through. He knew this was coming. She is under my protection. Each word landed separately. That predates the examination. The Accord's charter does not override a pre-existing sovereign protection declaration. A protection declaration made before paternity was confirmed carries a different legal weight than one made after. You know this. Kyle held her gaze for a moment. Then he stepped forward. If she leaves this house, under whatever arrangement you want to call neutral, she does not come back. You and I both know what happens to leverage once it is in a neutral facility. He moved one step closer, and Vaughan did not step back, but she did reassess. You will not have her. You will not have the child. And if the Accord sends anyone to this address again without a formal invitation, I will respond the way I respond to any uninvited entry. Vaughan looked at him. She looked at Mara. She picked up the charter document and returned it to the case. The Accord's position is on record. You have until the first bell tomorrow to submit a counter-declaration through formal channels. If we do not receive it, the Compact's full council will ratify a recovery order. She paused. You understand what that means. You will be standing alone. She left. The 2 men at the threshold left with her. The doors, at least, were closed on the way out. Kale stood with his back to Mara for a long moment. Then, I apologize that this happened in front of you. Stop apologizing to me and tell me what Article 11 actually does. He told her. It took 20 minutes, and it was precise and honest, and at several points she asked questions that caused him to pause before answering, because the questions were specific enough that the usual simplifying language did not serve. When he finished, she was still for a moment. Then, I should go. He said nothing. If I am not here, the charter trigger does not apply to your house. You would be defending a woman with no formal status rather than a contested ward. The legal weight is different, and you know it is. The legal weight is not the variable I am optimizing for. You have 4 factions moving against you by tonight. That is not a manageable number because of me. Because of the Accord's decision to pursue a claim that is, she cut him off before he could finish. I know whose decision it is. She stood. The crackers and the toast had helped, and she was steadier than she had been at 8:30, and she used that steadiness now because she needed it to say the next thing clearly. I have always been the reason things go wrong for people who let me close. That is not self-pity. That is a pattern I have observed across enough data points that I consider it reliable. He watched her. My mother died from complications of my birth. The hospital that trained me lost its primary funding contract 6 weeks after it hired me on full salary, which the administrator made sure I understood was correlational. The man who got me the kitchen placement lost the event catering account the same month I was placed on it. She stopped. You let me into your house last night, and tonight there are 4 factions moving against you. I am telling you the pattern. You are telling me a story that someone constructed for you over a very long period, and that you have accepted as evidence because you were not given any other framework to evaluate it in. She picked up her coat from the hook near the connecting door. He crossed the room in 2 steps and put his hand flat against the door, not blocking her, not touching her, just placing himself in the equation. Not force. I will not hold you here by force, but I am asking you to wait. She looked at his hand on the door. 1 hour. 1 hour. He did not spend the hour talking. He spent most of it standing by the window, and she spent most of it in the chair, and neither of them filled the silence with anything unnecessary, which she appreciated more than she expected to. At 40 minutes he said, "The 9th of October. Yes, you came to the wrong floor. I thought it was the catering level. You heard a sound. I am a clinical person. Certain sounds require attention." He turned from the window. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was, she thought, the face of someone translating something complicated from one language into another. Then he did, again, what he had done in the examination room. He knelt, not a performance. He simply folded down to one knee on the floor of the sitting room where he had brought her crackers at 8:30, and he looked at her. I have been alive for 431 years. I have had 4 centuries of company from people who wanted something from me or feared something in me, and I have never, in that span, had someone come to a floor they were not supposed to be on and stop because they heard a sound that required attention. She held very still. You do not take up space you have not earned. You earn space by being present in it and applying judgment to what you find there. That is the entire mechanism, and you have been doing it your whole life in rooms that were too underfunded to notice. That is not, he pressed on before she could close the thought. The cut on your wrist. October. A serving tray edge. You had been working for 6 hours. You had come from a double shift at a secondary placement. You noticed the cut because I named it, but you had been managing it for 2 hours before you reached that floor, which I know because the wound had already begun to close. You were managing it because you are the kind of person who manages what requires managing and does not ask for assistance until the situation is acute. She was quiet. Your mother died. That is a terrible thing, and it happened to you, and it did not happen because of you. Those are not the same event. She met his eyes. The hospital lost its contract because hospital funding contracts are political instruments in a public system that is perpetually underfunded, and the sequence of your employment and the contract loss is a coincidence that was weaponized by a man who needed someone to blame. The catering account followed the same logic. You looked into it. I looked into you. The night you left the number, because I am 431 years old, and I know the difference between someone who is a problem and someone who has been handed problems by people who should have been better. She breathed. She had carried that sentence in various forms since she was old enough to understand what it meant that her birth and her mother's death were the same event. She had carried it through 6 years of clinical training and 43 births and a terminated contract and 3 months on Creswick Lane and 11 weeks of not using a phone number she had nonetheless saved. She let go of it. It did not vanish. Things like that do not vanish. But she let go of the weight of it, which was different. You should stand up. The floor is cold. I am aware. He stood. He told her what the binding was before he offered it, because he was the kind of man who believed in the provision of information before the request for consent, which she thought was a rarer quality than it should have been. It is a formal claim. Under my compact's law, it places you inside my protection permanently rather than provisionally. It requires blood, and it requires that you state it aloud, and it grants you two things: the legal standing to refuse any accord claim on the child, and the ability to move through this house's formal defences as its sovereign would. What does that last part mean in practical terms? The wards respond to you. The protections built into this building across 4 centuries of accumulated work will read you as primary rather than as a guest. She thought about this. And the Accord's charter does not override a binding claim the way it overrides a protection declaration. No, because the binding is a family status, not a custodial arrangement. Yes, she was still for a long moment, and you are offering this. Not requiring it. I am offering it. If you want to know what I want you to take it. But I will not push you toward it by naming what I want. Because this is your choice to make, and I am aware that you have been in a room all day where people with interests were angling for outcomes. She looked at her hands. She had spent 6 years learning to trust her own clinical reading of a situation. What she was reading now was a man who was watching her with the careful stillness of someone who is not going to influence the result, and who has made this decision in advance and is holding to it. Show me. He sat across from her. He explained the mechanism. She asked 3 specific questions about the blood component, because she was a medical professional and the questions were sensible, and he answered all 3 without impatience. When she had the information she needed, she held it for 1 moment. Then she reached across and took his hand, and she turned it over, and she pressed her thumb into her own palm until the small necessary wound opened, and she placed her palm against his and said the words he had given her, clearly without a waver, because she was the kind of person who, when she had decided on a course of action, committed to it with full clinical precision. The room did not change. There was no light, no sound, no dramatic shift in the air, but she felt the wards settle around her the way a familiar hospital ward settles when you arrive early in the morning and the building recognizes that you know what you are doing. I would like to know what I can do with that now. He regarded her with an expression that was equal parts admiration and something more careful. In theory, you could lock every door in this building. In theory, you would need about 3 minutes of focused attention and a reasonable understanding of the structural layout. I have been doing spatial memory exercises since I was 19. I know. The first bell came and went. No counter-declaration had been filed, because Cale had not filed one, which she had understood by 9 that evening was itself a statement. He was not going to offer the Accord a document to argue against. He was going to give them silence, which in his world apparently read as a particular kind of answer. At 11 minutes past midnight, the perimeter alarm triggered. She felt it before she heard it. The wards shifted, a change in pressure she could not have described to anyone who had not just spent the better part of an evening becoming part of the building's formal architecture. She was on her feet before the sound reached her. Kael was already in motion. East wing. The study. Lock it from inside. Where are you going? To deal with this. That is not an answer. It is the accurate answer. He crossed to the door, and then he paused, and he turned back. The building will tell you where I am. It will feel wrong if something happens to me. I need you to know that so you are not frightened by the sensation. It is information. What does it feel like when something happens to you? Cold, from the centre outward. She had time to process this, and then he was through the door. She went to the study. She did not lock the door, because the study had the eastern window, and the eastern window showed the courtyard, and she was not going to sit in a locked room not knowing what was happening any more than she would have stood behind the nursing station while a patient coded. She stood at the window. She could not see him directly, but she could feel the shape of the wards and where they were stressed and where they held. And she understood after approximately 4 minutes that the primary breach was through the northern gate, and that what was happening there was significant and targeted, and had been planned in advance by people who knew the layout. The wards were holding. She felt him move through the north courtyard, felt the building's response to his position the way she had felt a delivery room respond to a lead clinician arriving, that specific settling of everything into a framework of competence, and she tracked him through it, and she breathed. She was still at the window when she heard the footsteps in the corridor. They were not his footsteps. She knew this the way she knew the difference between regular labour progress and a complication, which was the quality of sound and the specific wrong rhythm of it. His footsteps in this building would have felt like her own. These felt like a foreign instrument introduced into a field that was hers. She moved away from the window. She looked at the room. She assessed it the way she assessed a delivery room at the beginning of a shift. Where are the instruments? Where are the risks? What do I have to work with? On the side table, a glass instrument jar containing a bone-handled probe and 2 smaller tools, part of Halson's secondary kit left when he departed. She picked up the jar. On the shelf, a medical text with a spine thick enough to be useful. She picked that up too. The door handle turned. She breathed out. She had worked rooms where equipment failed and people panicked, and the outcome depended entirely on whoever kept their hands steady. She was not going to be afraid of a door opening. The man who came through the door was one of the 2 who had stood at the threshold that morning when Vaughan visited. He was larger than she remembered. That happened sometimes. People were always larger when they arrived with purpose. He took in the jar in her hand. He smiled, which told her everything she needed to know about how he was assessing her, which was to say, incorrectly. You do not want to do that. I disagree. He moved toward her. She let him get close because she knew that fighting with an instrument required proximity, and because in her experience, men who were certain they were winning moved without caution, and moved faster than they intended to. He reached for her arm. She stepped inside his reach and broke the instrument jar across his left temple with the full force of a woman who had spent 3 years transferring patients, who outweighed her by 40 kilos and had developed upper body strength that nobody credited her with having. He stumbled. She did not wait. She took the bone-handled probe from the broken scatter of glass on the floor, and she drove it into the back of his right hand and through the skin into the door frame behind him, which pinned the hand in a way that was precise and deliberate, and which she had enough anatomical knowledge to know would not cause permanent damage, but would cause immediate and complete immobility of the limb. He made a sound. She stepped back. He looked at his hand. He looked at her. His face cycled through several expressions in rapid sequence, ending on one she recognized from clinical situations, which was the expression of someone who has just been corrected by a variable they had not included in their assessment. The wards know I am here. The binding was formal and it was completed. If you want to test what that means for someone who just entered this building with hostile intent, I would encourage you to try to pull your hand free. He did not. He looked at her with the specific disbelief of a man who had entered a room expecting a guest and had encountered something else entirely. I am a midwife. I have been in rooms where things went wrong for 6 years and I have never lost a patient because I panicked. You entered my building. She paused. You should probably be thinking about that. He stopped trying to move his hand. She stood in the study with the medical text in her left hand and the broken base of the instrument jar in her right, and she watched the door, and she felt the wards and felt him moving through the north courtyard at significant speed. The temperature of it, the direction, the closing distance, and she breathed evenly, in and out. The way she breathed through the final stage of a difficult delivery, because the management of difficult situations required a steady breath more than it required anything else. The door opened. He stopped in the doorway. He took in the room in approximately 2 seconds, the way a very old and precise person takes in a room when they are looking for a threat that is still active. He looked at the man pinned to the doorframe. He looked at the probe. He looked at Mara. He is not permanently injured. The probe is through the dorsal interosseous. I avoided the tendons. Kael held her gaze for one more moment. Then he crossed to the man at the doorframe and pulled the probe free, which caused the man to exhale sharply, and he took him by the collar and walked him back to the doorway and put him in the corridor, and he looked down at him with an expression that was not anger, because anger requires effort, and this required none. You walked into a room that did not belong to you, and you did not leave when you had the opportunity. Go back to Vaughn. Tell her the ward held. Tell her what you found in the study. He paused. Tell her exactly what you found. The man left. At the end of the corridor, 11 members of the Accord's party were kneeling. Not in submission, precisely, in the specific posture of people who have been placed in a position by someone who has made it structurally impossible to stand, without it meaning something they'd not want it to mean. Cassia Vaughn was not kneeling. She was standing with her document case under her arm and her coat still buttoned, and she looked, for the first time since she had entered this house that morning, like a person who had arrived at a calculation they did not expect. The binding is complete. Kael's voice carried the length of the corridor without effort. She holds full sovereign status under compact law. Article 11 does not apply to a compact sovereign. You know this. Vaughn said nothing. The recovery order, if ratified, would be directed against a sovereign of equivalent standing to a full council member. The Accord's charter does not provide for war with its own standing membership. He met her eyes. I imagine you would like to update your calculation before you return to the council. The council will require a formal record. Aldrich will have it ready by morning. She looked past him to the study doorway, where Mara was still standing with the base of a broken instrument jar in her hand. She held that look for a long moment. The child will be formidable. She turned and walked toward the exit. Behind her, 11 members of the Accord's party rose from their knees and followed. The house went quiet. It was not the silence of before, which had been the silence of a building at night. It was the silence of a building that has been tested at its edges and has held, which was a different quality entirely, and she felt it through the binding the way she might feel the shift in a ward when the critical window has passed and the patient is stable. Halson appeared from somewhere with a medical bag and looked at her hands for cuts from the broken glass, with the brisk attention of a man who has long since passed the point of surprise. He found 2 small ones, addressed them, and departed. Kael stood by the window where she had stood during the siege. She could see, from the set of his shoulders, that the transition was happening, the one she had watched in the examination room when he moved from the precise authority of the formal proceeding back to something more human in scale. It was not a comfortable transition for him, she thought. It was the movement between 2 versions of himself, and he was never quite certain, on the other side of it, which version had been visible. She crossed the room and stood beside him. You saw what I did in the corridor? Yes, and in the courtyard before that. I felt it. The wards. It amounts to the same thing. She looked at the window. The courtyard below was empty and lit by the same old-fashioned light as the entrance hall. She thought about what he had said in October, when he had looked up from the chair in the dark room and said only, "You have a cut on your wrist." No preamble, no question. Just the fact, and then the kit from the cabinet. In October, when I came to the wrong floor. You said in case. Yes, that was not a gesture, that was a preparation. You were already thinking about what it might require. He was quiet. You are not a monster. She turned to look at him. You are someone who has been doing an enormous amount of work for 431 years in rooms where being precise and being dangerous were the same thing. That is not a character flaw. That is a job description. He regarded her with the expression she had begun to recognize as the one that meant he was translating again. You handed me a number in October and said in case. I used it. This is what in case looks like. He was quiet for a long moment. Then you pinned his hand to a door frame. With clinical precision. Yes, he paused. Yes, you did. 2 days later, she found the service lift on the residential level. Not because she was lost. She found it because she had spent the previous 48 hours learning the spatial layout of the building with the focused attention she had described to him, and she had tracked the structural logic of it from the stairwells outward. And she had located every access point, including 3 she was fairly certain he did not know she had found. She was also fairly certain he knew she had found them. She opened the service lift, assessed its dimensions and its mechanism, noted that it ran on a counterweight system that was older than most of the buildings she had lived in, and closed it again. She went back to the kitchen, which she had also mapped thoroughly on the grounds that knowing where the food was constituted reasonable preparation, and she put the kettle on. He appeared in the kitchen doorway at some point shortly afterward, the way he often did, which was quietly and without announcement, and he looked at the kettle and then at her. The service lift on the residential level. The counterweight needs adjustment. It is pulling about 4 degrees to the left on descent. If someone uses it in an emergency, particularly in a hurry, that imbalance is a hazard. He absorbed this. You found the service lift, and the 2 access points behind the east study and the one under the north stair that I believe predates the current structure. A beat of silence. I have lived in this building for 214 years. I have been here for 48 hours. Spatial memory. He sat down at the kitchen table with the expression of a man who is genuinely pleased and is not entirely sure what to do with the sensation. She made the tea. This is a story about a woman who was told her whole life that she arrived with the wrong currency, that she cost more than she contributed, that the things she was good at were the wrong things to be good at. It is a story about what happens when someone pays attention to evidence instead of assumption, and about what it looks like when a person is given the room to use everything they actually are. If you love this story, please like, share, and subscribe to Dark Romance Chronicles.